I'm going to start out this description with an overview of the Heathkit Resistance Decade Boxes, or Decade Resistance Boxes as they call them, from Chuck Penson's excellent book Heathkit Test Equipment Products. Heathkit's first Decade Resistance Boxes were the model RD-1, coming out in 1950 and being manufactured essentially unchanged through 1962. It was a very simple resistance substitution box, but it was built in a nice birch wooden cabinet. It provides ohms from 1 ohm to 99,999 ohms in 1 ohm steps. It uses 0.5% resistor values, but the catalogs were not always clear on this, sometimes listing them as 1%. And in fact, that may have been the case with some of them, because Heathkit did seem to be going through different manufacturers of resistors over that span of years, and there may have been a period in there where they may have been using 1% instead of 0.5% resistors. 2 years after the introduction of the RD-1, Heathkit for some reason decided to change the designation or the model number from RD-1 to DR-1, and they're exactly the same except for the flipping of the 2 letters. Having said that, there are a number of permutations within the RD-1 lineup. There are different knob types that are used. There are different color schemes on the front panel, although the graphics remain the same. There are some that are practically black. There are ones that are dark gray with white trim. There are the ones that are kind of a tan with black trim, ones that are a beige with red trim, and there may be others in addition to that. When the RD-1 was discontinued in 1962, Heathkit replaced it with the IN-11, which is basically the same design. If you can really call a resistance decade box a design, they would all be done the same way. But the only real difference is that they went from 5 ranges to 6 ranges and changed the case style. The RD-1 DR-1 type only went up through a 10K range, whereas the IN-11 has a 100K range, so an extra order of magnitude on the top end. This model was made from 1962 to 1967. They were once again 0.5% resistors, and they, as noted here in Chuck Penson's book, they all have a 0.43 ohm resistance at the terminals, even when all switches are set to 0. That's just internal switch resistance and internal wiring resistance. And of course, unless you have a 4-point ohm meter, you're going to read additional resistance if you just hook an ohm meter up to these, because of the resistance of the ohm meter's own leads. So it may be more like, 1 ohm residual or quiescent, or even 1.43 or something like that, which in some ways makes the low ohms range, the units range, kind of moot. Even though the resistors are accurate, by the time you hook it into a circuit and you have the residual or quiescent resistances added in, you're off by 1 or 2 notches already. This model was discontinued in 1967, and as Chuck Penson's book says, it was replaced by the IN-17, which is right here. They went from that scheme to this. This was their beige and tan scheme, and otherwise it's exactly the same. Just the graphics are a little different, and the paint colors are different, and the knob style is different, but the sheet metal is exactly the same, and everything inside is exactly the same. So this one took over in 1967, and they made it for 10 years, discontinuing it in 1977. Now this is an interesting thing here. I wonder if it's actually a typo in the Penson book. The Ion 11 is showing as a $24.94 unit, whereas the Ion 17 is shown as $6.95. That's kind of odd. When this was discontinued in 1977, it was replaced by the 3117, which is this one here. And I have a 3117. This was carried on for nearly another 10 years, being finally discontinued in 1985. And it was selling for $42.95. Again, it's just a cosmetic upgrade. They went from the beige and tan to the newer Heathkit blue and eggshell white color scheme and the different style knobs. So in this video, I'm going to start out with the RD-1s in my collection, or the DR-1, same thing, and end up with the Ion 3117, spanning the entire history of Heathkit's Decade Resistance Boxes. So this is the case from the one that's cosmetically worse and broken internally, but it's the nicer looking wooden case of the two. So I'm going to put the better condition guts into this one. Hopefully it'll fit. It's binding down there. Have to figure out what to do with that. And it goes the other way around. They've actually offset those center wooden pieces to fit between the switches, so that's okay. Everything snaps in pretty nicely. Well, I've deoxed the switches and cleaned everything up, and hopefully it will work now. Okay, everything's set to 0 and I'm reading about 2 ohms. If I go to the 1 ohm setting, it's off by, it's off by about 2 ohms. Let's go to 2, we go to 3, keep adding 1. And now I'm at 9, and I've got a smaller offset, but it's still a little high. It's still roughly not quite 2 ohms over the actual setting. Let's try 10s. This should be roughly 10 ohms, and again it's 10 plus 2. 22, 32, 42, approximately 52, 60, 70. It's working much better than it did before. Deoxing those really helped a lot. So now let's go to hundreds. This should be roughly 100, and it's got again a 2 ohm offset. 2, 3, 4. And that's should be 900 ohms. And there it went a little bit under. Now let's go to 1000 ohms. 2, 3, 4K, 5K, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now we'll go to 10,000s. That should be about 10K, pretty close. 30,000 and change. 40,000, 50,000. So if I want to dial in 24,775, of course the meter doesn't read that many digits, but that should be 24/7, so it's rolling up. In combinations here we don't get quite the precision, but it's still pretty decent. Okay. And it's not even really the Decade box. My meter, just with its leads, reads about 1.8 ohms, so that was in the meter's own leads, not really in the Decade box itself. Meters like this aren't really designed to read precise low resistance values, so you know, it's kind of a crapshoot with these, but there are meters that are set up to read very low resistance values accurately, and a general purpose multimeter like this is not one of them. This somewhat pricier B&K precision meter is reading about 0.4 ohms with the leads shorted. So with that hooked up, I am still getting the same resistance. And if I go to 1 ohm, yeah, so the box is actually quite accurate. It's just the offset the meter is asking or adding to it. So it's hard to take a decent picture of these with a widescreen aspect ratio on my camera and a device that's inherently tall and skinny. That came out pretty well. Not a lot of work to do on it, just some general cleanup. And that is the prettier case of the two. And I've got my State of Washington tag on there. And here's the ugly duckling. Different brand of resistors in it than the other one, but the same model of Heathkit. And the soldering value on this, even though this is the one originally from the State of Washington, the soldering job on this is pretty bad. It's not like there's big balls of solder, but there's a lot of joints that are kind of cold. I can't probably get a good view of that one, but and I would call that probably a cold solder joint. You know, some of these are okay, but a very iffy job of construction on this. You know, this one down here looks pretty cold. Just generally a poorer job of soldering. I'm going to try to do some basic repairs on this to see if I can get most of it working. Well, these three resistors on the units range, they obviously got hot, all three of them, although this one here hasn't. This is the whatever it is, 5 ohm resistor probably, because they combine 1, 2, 3, and 5 in various combinations to get everything from 1 ohm to 9 ohms. And the solder joints are crappier here too, and these are a different brand, like they burned them out and replaced them with something else, but you can even see here that some solder or something has kind of baked out of them when they got hot. But when I put my meter on there, they're actually reading the correct values, so they may be toasted in terms of their coating, but they seem to still have continuity through them. so maybe I don't need to replace them. I'll just touch up some of the solder joints here and deox this and see what happens. Okay, switch is deoxed. Hooking it up to my meter, and I'm getting about the same 0.4 ohms that I usually get just with its own leads. I'm going to go up through the units here. Some of the deox got on my switches. So that's 1 ohm, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's all working now. Oops. Now, tens, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. Okay, hundreds. 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. Yeah, basically 0.59 k ohms, so 600, about 700, 800, 900. Okay, about 1k, it's 0.998 k, 2k, 3k, 4k, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And this is 10k, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90k. And I should be able to go 80, 83k, or 3,200. Yeah, 3.12, 3.18. So that should be 200 ohms and 4, so 240, pretty close. I'm going to go to 63 ohms. Pretty good. It's working in all combinations. Well, in some combinations on all ranges, I should say. Okay, that guy is resurrected. It's not as nice as the other one, but it's definitely working. Success! For my Heathkit IN-3117 Decade Resistance Kit, as they call it, which is kind of odd. They usually didn't refer to their kits as kits in the manual. This was another eBay purchase. I'd had one like this a long time ago, but it disappeared. Don't know what happened to it. Probably took it to work and forgot to bring it back or something. Anyway, so this is another one just like it, basically in good condition, needs a bit of cleanup. But the first thing I wanted to do is get inside, and the screws are all just turning, but without loosening or coming out. And a lot of these Heathkits of this period used speed nuts, just little bent sheet metal speed nuts, and if you over tighten them, then they would become damaged to the point where you couldn't get the screws out. So I used my drill press to drill through the heads of the screws to the point where there was no head remaining. It was just the screw, and so then it came through the holes. And here you can see the damaged speed nuts that were the culprit. So this design, which was made in the, was it 3 different models over the years, it is similar to the original DR-1 or RD-1 in the sense that it has switches and resistors which get connected in various combinations to result in the desired resistance. However, the DR-1 RD-1 used only 4 resistors per range and connected them in various combinations, whereas the IN3117 and its predecessors actually have 10 resistors per range. So it is really just using one of the resistors, whichever one is selected in each range. And they are also precision wire wound. They, I think they're 1% or better. And you can see here that it's very simple, although there's a bit more soldering involved because there are more resistors. And the other thing that distinguishes this design from the DR-1/RD-1 is that there is that extra 100K range on the top end, which the earlier model didn't have. One thing I didn't mention earlier, that although this particular unit is pretty clean overall, it does have that one damaged knob on the units range. The knob itself is actually okay. It had a hairline crack, but no big deal. But the brushed aluminum insert or cap on the front end was missing. Anyway, so I hooked the cleaned up. I'd sprayed some deoxit on the switches, resoldered a couple solder joints that didn't look all that great, tightened up the terminal posts, and dialed in a value, and the ohmmeter said it was correct. Good start. Getting into more detail, I set the box to 0 ohms, verified I had a small residual resistance, and then started checking out the low units range resistances. Not to show all the nitty-gritty, but here's 9 ohms set up, and 9 ohms plus the residual resistance. Then with the 10s range on 3, I'm measuring a 30 ohms plus about the same residual. The 100 ohm step on 4 gives me about 400 ohms, actually right on 400 ohms. And the 1K range on 6 is giving me 6K, pretty good precision there. The 10K range on 7 is giving me 70K. And the 100K range on 9 is giving me 0.9 megs. And then some combinations. 352K measures out at 352. And a dialed up 638 is reading 639, but that's picking up that low end residual in there. Taking a closer look at the resistors, the first range is all 1 ohm, 0.5% tolerance. Looks like they're all 1 watt. And then you've got the 10s and the 100s, and the 1000s, again 0.5%. The 10K range, they're all the same value again. And the 100K range. Most of these don't show the part where it says 1 watt, but you could spot the 1W on a few of them. So in that sense, they have the same precision and wattage ratings as the older DR-1 or RD-1. Nothing else to do on this except button up the case. The hardware store, the smallest size speed nuts they had were 832, where the originals were, I believe, 632. And I destroyed the original 632 screws anyway, so I bought some nice black anodized button head 832 bolts. And I did have to drill out the holes in the case ever so slightly to allow a clearance on these. And there are the new bolts put in, and a little cleanup of the front panel. I still have that bad knob on there, and the feet on the bottom are the original feet. They have shifted a little bit, probably it got warm somewhere, but they're still on there nice and tight, so I didn't mess with them. Rummaging around in my box of knobs, I found an old Radio Shack knob that I was just going to substitute for the bad knob here. They look pretty similar, but then I realized that the inserts are the same diameter and the same appearance, so I just carefully pried the insert off the Radio Shack knob and super glued it onto the front of the original knob, and that worked out pretty well.
I did have a couple of slight ripples in the aluminum insert just from prying it out, but it's pretty minor, so I'm not going to try to improve that any.
As usual with these Heathkit projects, I usually go over the manual, and I did find a pristine, it looked like it was never used, DR-1 manual. This manual dates from 1958. This is back when the Heathkit manuals had inside the covers all the resistor color codes for capacitors, and that's back when capacitors were identified by color codes. And a lot of the resistors had these crazy systems that you never see anymore, but they were spelling out every permutation and variation on resistor and capacitor color codes, including the molded mica types with their dot patterns, the molded paper type capacitors with their various systems, and for that matter, they also had somewhat, by today's standards, antiquated schematic diagram symbology. Anyway, so we start out with the introduction page. It just mentions the specifications, 1 ohm to 99.999 ohms in 1 ohm ranges. Maximum current, 500 milliamps in the units, 150 in the tens, 50 milliamps in the hundreds, 15 milliamps in the thousands, and 5 milliamps in the 10,000s. And it confirms that it's a birch cabinet. It's not solid birch, it's plywood, and it may only be birch veneer, but I guess the part you see is still birch. The kit isn't that complicated, there's only a few pages, and it doesn't have much in the way of pictures, it's mostly just text descriptions. You know, there are a couple of diagrams there how to mount the termination posts, a list of components, and then the one assembly diagram with a detail. You're basically building the same simple pattern 5 different times, so I guess you don't really need that much, but contrasting this to some later Heathkit manuals, a lot of the text is in sort of a italics, a handwritten italics. Fairly clear diagrams. Now, even though this is pretty simple, and you can see why they didn't bother putting a schematic diagram in the manual, I'm kind of obsessed with having schematic diagrams for things that I own. And I was mostly curious how they were using the resistors on each range, in how they were combining them in different patterns. There's more than one way to do it. So I made my own schematic. I rang out the fairly complicated selector switch, which has a total of 5 plates on it, on 2 different wafers, front and rear of the wafers, and one of them is a double plate wafer. So you actually have this one, this row, and I'm sorry, this one's only 4 plates. I was thinking of the equivalent capacitance one. That one had 5. And then 2 more here, and then with 2 sets of wipers that are connecting between the sets of plates. So the overall schematic is just like you would think it would be. It comes in on the left post, and it goes through the 10,000s range switch, the thousands, the hundreds, the tens, and the units, and goes out the right post. And then for each range, the schematic is exactly the same. Come in here, go to the one plate, and it selects it in 3 different ranges. One goes directly to this bus bar, another one goes through the 6 ohm resistor into the bus bar, and the other one comes back through a 3 ohm resistor into the bus bar. And then it taps out through either the 1 or the 2. So that's how you get the different combinations. And then for each position it picks off the resulting combinations and puts it to the final plate and then out to the next range. I put a little chart in here to identify the resistors that are being used per range in which combinations. And I also diagrammed the switch just to clarify a couple of things about how it's soldered up. Makes it handier for repair. And I put this up on my file share website, so if anybody else is seeking it, I'm going to include the link in the video and the description so that other people can glom onto this if they need it. For the IN3117, I also have a manual. It's another eBay purchase. None of these things ever seem to come with the manuals, but the manuals are pretty available on eBay and other online sales locations. Even Amazon lists them sometimes. Somebody goes in, they have a copy of a manual, and they create an Amazon listing for it. I'm not sure why that's better than putting it on eBay, but some people do it that way. And of course there are downloads, but there are fewer downloads of manuals these days because since the new Heathkit company took off a number of years ago, they seem to be fairly aggressive in finding the places that formerly shared freely the scans of old Heathkit manuals, and they are asserting copyright to them and making those websites take the scans down so you can't get them in those places anymore. And that does make it kind of rough. And the new Heath company says they'll reproduce the manuals, but from what I've read, it's kind of like pulling teeth to get the manuals out of them. Anyway, so table of contents, specifications, 1 ohm to 999,999 ohms in 1 ohm steps. Precision, just like the other one, is 0.5% accuracy. Resistors are all 1 watt. And the currents are basically the same. 500, 150, 50, 15, 5, and 1.5 milliamps for the new 100K range on the top end. And those are working ratings, but you can briefly go higher, pretty much doubling the working ratings. The resistors are going to get piping hot in that case, so you don't want to do it for very long. And this is another instance where I've harped on before. Even though Heathkit was a pretty reputable company, they still violated some basic engineering in a lot of their documentation. For example, the A abbreviation for amps should always be capitalized, and a small m for milli. They got that right here, but I think it's just because they were putting everything in lowercase. But they definitely screwed up on the small a for amps. They mentioned that the minimum DC resistance is about 0.025 ohms at the terminals with all switches set to 0. I found it to be a bit higher than that, but still pretty low. Circuit description. This one's a little more thorough, and this one does come with sort of a schematic, combination wiring diagram and schematic. And this does make it clear, if you haven't already seen, that there are 10 resistors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9 resistors per range, and they're all the same value in a given range. So the units has all 1 ohm resistors, the tens range has 10 ohm resistors, and so on. And they just get connected in combination. So if you've selected the 9 position, the incoming current has to go through all 9 resistors to get out and go on to the next stage. But if you switch the switch completely around to the other end of its travel, then you basically short out all the resistors on that range and just go straight through without adding anything in. So it really couldn't be any simpler. And then they have a equivalent wiring diagram there. Step-by-step assembly. initial operation check, final assembly, and a little bit of operation. Very simple. In case of difficulty, not much to it. And that's the whole manual. Now this might seem like the wrong video to put this last bit on, but my previous video in this series was on the Heathkit DC-1 Decade Capacitance Box and all the other models that followed it. And there were no schematics in any of those manuals for it. They just assumed, hey, it's just a capacitance box, you don't need a schematic. But still, somebody might be curious how they're combining the capacitors in various combinations to get all the different ranges. And most of them are pretty much no-brainers, but there are a few combinations where it could go one way or another. So I decided to scope it out and found out that the switches have 5 plate sets on 4 different sides, 2 wafers, 2 sides per wafer. And the first one really just picks off whenever it's not at 0. It connects through, and then you've got 3 sets of plates that bring in the well, let's see, 4 sets of plates that bring in the first part of the range, the 1 part of the range, and 3 plates that bring in the 2 part, 3 plates that bring in the 3 part, and 2 sets of plates that bring in the 4 part. So that's per unit. So on the lowest range, that's a 0.00, well, I'm not going to go with the microfarads, Heathkit used that, but we call it picofarads these days. So 100 picofarads, 200 picofarads, 300 picofarads, and 400 picofarads. And then, of course, those are bigger values on the other ranges. So this shows how they get combined, and then there's a chart that shows the same thing. There's a paragraph or 2 of the specific values used on each range. A note to clarify that all capacitors are 350 volts, 1% silver mica type. And then, just as with the resistance box, I have a breakdown diagram of one range showing how everything's connected up and what's where on each switch. Makes it easier for troubleshooting. I'm going to put the link for this one on my file share website too, so even though it's announced here in the wrong video, at least there's some announcement of it for those people who get off on this kind of thing. So I'll just go out on a quick view of the matching Heathkit Decade Condenser box covered in another one of my videos, and the Heathkit Decade Resistance box. The capacitance box is the DC-1, the resistance box is the DR-1, also known as the RD-1. Same thing.